The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana Territory, driving snow horizontally through the streets of Silver Creek. What had started as gentle flurries that morning had transformed into a full-blown blizzard by evening, trapping everyone who'd ventured into town within whatever shelter they could find. The Brass Dollar Saloon, normally a place where respectable women feared to tread, had become an unlikely refuge for travelers of all kinds. Maggie O'Sullivan pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she surveyed the crowded room from her chair near the stone fireplace. At 45, Maggie had learned to navigate the rough edges of frontier life, but she'd never imagined herself spending an evening in Jeremiah Polk's establishment. The boarding house she ran on Elm Street was only 3 blocks away, but it might as well have been 3 miles in this weather. "More coffee, Mrs. O'Sullivan?" asked Sally, the saloon's only barmaid, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar and the animated conversations of stranded travelers. "Thank you, dear," Maggie replied, accepting the steaming cup gratefully. The warmth seeped through the ceramic into her cold fingers, and she inhaled the rich aroma. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been forced to serve at her boarding house lately. The saloon buzzed with nervous energy. Cattlemen discussed delayed shipments, while traveling salesmen worried about missed appointments. Near the bar, 3 miners argued loudly about claim disputes, their voices growing more heated with each round of whiskey. In the corner, a family with 2 young children huddled together, the mother singing softly to keep them calm. Maggie's attention was drawn to movement near the saloon's entrance. A figure stood just inside the doorway, snow still clinging to a heavy buffalo coat. As her eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, she could see it was an elderly Native American man, his long gray hair braided with strips of leather, his weathered face bearing the quiet dignity she'd learned to recognize in the older generation of tribal people who occasionally passed through town. The man, she guessed him to be around 60, stood perfectly still, his dark eyes taking in the room with careful assessment. He made no move toward the bar or any of the tables, content to remain by the door despite the cold draft that swept in every time the wind rattled the frame. Maggie noticed something else, the way conversations quieted slightly as people became aware of his presence, not with outright hostility, but with the uncomfortable silence that often accompanied difference in these frontier towns. The man seemed accustomed to this reaction, his expression revealing nothing as he continued his patient vigil by the door. "Ain't he gonna order something?" muttered one of the miners, loud enough for half the room to hear. "This ain't no charity house." Jeremiah Polk, wiping down glasses behind the bar, glanced toward the doorway. "He can stand there long as he ain't causing trouble," he said gruffly. "Storm's got everyone spooked tonight." Maggie studied the elderly man more closely. His clothes, while clearly native in style, were well made and clean. The beadwork on his vest showed intricate craftsmanship, and his boots, though worn, had been recently mended. This wasn't a man down on his luck. He carried himself with too much pride for that. So why did he remain standing by the cold door? Understanding dawned on her slowly. In a saloon full of empty chairs and tables, the native man stood because no one had offered him a seat. Not out of any grand gesture of exclusion, but simply because it hadn't occurred to anyone that he might want to sit down like any other traveler seeking shelter from the storm. Maggie felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling that had compelled her to offer warm meals to down-on-their-luck miners, or to let struggling families stay an extra week at her boarding house when they couldn't make rent. Her late husband, Patrick, had called it her stubborn kindness, usually with an exasperated but loving shake of his head. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Maggie rose from her chair by the fire. The conversations around her continued, but she felt several pairs of eyes following her movement as she approached the elderly man. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice clear despite the flutter of nervousness in her stomach. "I was wondering if you'd like to take my chair by the fire. This storm's brought quite a chill, and that spot by the door must be terribly cold." The man's dark eyes met hers with surprise that quickly gave way to careful evaluation. For a moment, Maggie worried she'd overstepped some cultural boundary she didn't understand. Then his weathered face softened into the hint of a smile. "That is very kind, ma'am," he said, his English accented but clear. "But I would not wish to take your place." "Nonsense," Maggie replied, gesturing toward the chair. "I've been hogging the best spot in the house for near an hour now. Besides, I was thinking of moving closer to the bar anyway. Sally makes excellent coffee, and I find myself in need of another cup." The elderly man studied her face for another moment, as if trying to determine whether her offer was genuine or born of pity. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he inclined his head in a gesture of respect. "I am Joseph Standing Bear," he said simply, and I accept your kindness with gratitude. Margaret O'Sullivan, she replied, extending her hand in the forthright manner that had scandalized some of the more proper ladies in town. But most folks call me Maggie. Joseph took her hand briefly, his grip firm despite his age. It is good to meet you, Maggie O'Sullivan. As Joseph settled into the chair by the fire, Maggie noticed how the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. He stretched his hands toward the flames, and she caught a glimpse of old scars across his knuckles, the marks of a man who'd worked hard and lived through difficult times. The room's atmosphere had shifted subtly. The conversations resumed their normal volume, and several people nodded approvingly at Maggie's gesture. Even Jeremiah Polk brought Joseph a cup of coffee without being asked, grumbling something about being neighborly in bad weather. Maggie found herself a spot at a small table near the bar, close enough to the fire to stay warm, but giving Joseph space to enjoy the heat in peace. As she sipped her coffee, she occasionally glanced his way, noting how he sat with the stillness of someone comfortable with silence, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the building, and snow piled higher against the windows. But inside the Brass Dollar Saloon, a small act of kindness had created a pocket of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Neither Maggie nor Joseph could have known, as they sat in comfortable silence that storm-swept evening, that this simple exchange of chair for courtesy would be the beginning of something neither had expected to find again in their lives, a true and lasting friendship. The storm had blown itself out sometime before dawn, leaving Silver Creek buried under 2 feet of pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the early morning sun. Maggie stood at the window of her boarding house kitchen, watching the town slowly dig itself out from the blizzard's embrace. The coffee pot bubbled cheerfully on the wood stove, filling the room with its rich aroma as she prepared breakfast for her 3 current boarders. It had been nearly midnight when the storm finally calmed enough for folks to venture out of the Brass Dollar. Maggie had made her way home through the knee-deep snow, her thoughts returning again and again to the quiet dignity of Joseph Standing Bear. Something about their brief interaction had stayed with her through the night, not just his polite gratitude, but the way he'd carried himself with such grace despite the subtle dismissal he'd faced from others in the saloon. Mrs. O'Sullivan, that coffee smells like heaven itself, called Tom Bradley as he clomped down the stairs, snow still clinging to his boots from his early morning attempt to clear a path to the street. Tom was a telegraph operator, a thin, nervous man in his 30s, who sent most of his wages back to his ailing mother in Ohio. "Good morning, Tom," Maggie replied, pouring him a cup. "I trust you slept well despite the wind." "Like a baby once it stopped trying to tear the roof off," he said with a grin. "Say, wasn't that something last night? Heard you got stuck in Polk's saloon with half the town." Before Maggie could respond, the kitchen door opened and Samuel Hartwell entered, brushing snow from his coat. Samuel was a traveling preacher, an earnest young man who held services in the schoolhouse every other Sunday. His circuit covered 3 towns, and he'd been returning from Canyon Falls when the storm hit. "Good morning, Mrs. O'Sullivan, Mr. Bradley," Samuel said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? The Lord certainly knows how to paint a landscape. Beautiful if you don't mind feeling like you're living inside a snow globe," chuckled Martha Henley as she joined them. Martha was Maggie's longest-term boarder, a seamstress in her 50s who'd come west after her husband died in the war. She had a sharp wit and an even sharper needle, and her alterations work kept her in steady demand among the town's ladies. As they gathered around the kitchen table for breakfast, eggs, bacon, and Maggie's famous buttermilk biscuits, the conversation naturally turned to the previous evening's adventure. "I heard tell there was quite a mix of folks taking shelter," Martha said, cutting into her eggs. "Miners, cattlemen, that family with the little ones." "And Joseph Standing Bear," Maggie added quietly, testing the waters. "Standing Bear?" Samuel looked up with interest. "I believe I've heard that name. Isn't he the fellow who sometimes guides survey crews through the mountain passes?" Tom nodded enthusiastically. "That's him. My supervisor at the telegraph office says he's one of the most reliable guides in the territory, knows every trail between here and the Canadian border, and he's honest as the day is long. Never heard a bad word about him from any of the crews he's worked with." "Really?" Maggie found herself leaning forward, curious to learn more. "Oh yes," Martha chimed in, surprising everyone. "He's done some translation work for the territorial government too. My friend Clara works at the courthouse, and she says whenever they need someone who can speak both Crow and English fluently, they call on him. Apparently he helped negotiate that timber agreement last fall that prevented a lot of trouble. Samuel buttered his biscuit thoughtfully. Sounds like a man of considerable skill and character. It's unfortunate how quickly we judge others based on appearance rather than actions. You're right about that, preacher, Tom agreed. My pa always said you can tell more about a man by how he treats folks who can't do nothing for him than by how he talks to his betters. Maggie smiled at that, remembering how Joseph had accepted her offer of the chair with such quiet dignity. He struck me as a gentleman, she said simply. Spoke better English than half the miners in town, and he had proper manners. Course he does, Martha said matter-of-factly. Clara told me he spent some time at one of them mission schools when he was young, back before he decided to return to his people. Learned to read and write in English, arithmetic, even some Latin, if you can believe that. The revelation surprised Maggie. She'd assumed Joseph was educated based on his speech, but the extent of his learning was impressive for anyone on the frontier, regardless of background. Seems like a man who's walked in both worlds, Samuel observed. That takes considerable strength of character. After breakfast, as Maggie cleaned up the kitchen, she found herself thinking about Joseph Standing Bear with new understanding. Here was a man who'd deliberately chosen to bridge two very different ways of life, using his skills to help prevent conflicts and misunderstandings. No wonder he carried himself with such quiet confidence. Around mid-morning, as she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, Maggie heard the sound of an axe biting into wood. Following the sound, she discovered that someone had been busy clearing the fallen branch that had blocked her back gate during the storm. The wood had been neatly split and stacked beside her woodshed, and the gate now swung freely. "Tom! Samuel!" she called, thinking one of her boarders might have tackled the job. "Wasn't us, Mrs. O'Sullivan," Tom replied from the front porch where he was shoveling snow. "We've been working on the front path all morning." Puzzled, Maggie examined the work more closely. The cuts were clean and precise, the work of someone skilled with an axe. The wood had been stacked with care, each piece placed just so. It was the sort of job that spoke of someone who took pride in doing things properly, even when no one was watching. As she stood there, wondering who might have done such a kindness, she noticed something else. A single set of tracks in the snow leading from the alley to her gate and back again. The prints were from well-made boots, with a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel. A memory stirred, the same boots she'd noticed on Joseph Standing Bear the night before in the saloon. "Well, I'll be," she murmured to herself, a warm feeling spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Later that afternoon, as Maggie walked to Grayson's general store for supplies, she found herself scanning the faces of people on the street, hoping to catch sight of Joseph. She wanted to thank him for clearing her gate, though she suspected he'd done it precisely because he didn't expect thanks. At the store, she overheard Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, the banker's wife, discussing the previous evening with her friend Mrs. Pearl Hammond. "I heard Margaret O'Sullivan made quite a spectacle of herself at the saloon last night," Mrs. Thornton was saying in the tone she reserved for particularly juicy gossip. "Oh?" Mrs. Hammond leaned in eagerly. "Do tell. Apparently she gave up her seat to some Indian fellow, right there in front of everyone. I'm not saying it wasn't Christian charity, mind you, but really, in a public establishment like that, what sort of message does it send?" Maggie felt her cheeks flush, not with embarrassment, but with irritation. Before she could stop herself, she stepped around the corner of the aisle. "It sends the message that common courtesy isn't determined by the color of a person's skin, Elizabeth," she said calmly, enjoying the way both women jumped at her unexpected appearance. Mrs. Thornton recovered quickly, her smile tight and artificial. "Oh, Margaret, dear, we heard about your kindness last night. Very charitable of you." "It wasn't charity," Maggie replied evenly. "It was simple good manners. Joseph Standing Bear is a respected guide and translator who's done considerable service for this territory. He deserved a seat by the fire, same as anyone else caught in that storm." "Joseph Standing Bear?" Mrs. Hammond looked surprised. "Oh my, I had no idea. My husband's mentioned that name. Isn't he the one who helped with the Henderson survey last summer?" "The very same," Maggie confirmed, taking some satisfaction in watching Mrs. Thornton's expression shift as she realized she might have misjudged the situation. "Well," Mrs. Thornton said stiffly, "I suppose that does put a different light on things." As Maggie completed her purchases and left the store, she felt a new determination settling in her chest. Joseph Standing Bear had shown her kindness by clearing her gate, expecting nothing in return. If the town gossips wanted to make something of her treating him with basic human decency, so be it. She'd faced down worse than wagging tongues in her time. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains when Maggie finally spotted Joseph near the livery stable, checking the shoes on a sturdy paint horse. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle either man or animal. "Good afternoon, Mr. Standing Bear," she called when she was close enough. He looked up from the horse's hoof, his weathered face creasing into a slight smile. "Good afternoon, Maggie O'Sullivan. I trust you made it home safely last night?" "I did indeed, thank you. And I believe I have you to thank for clearing that fallen branch from my back gate this morning." Joseph straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "A small thing. The wood will be useful for your stove." "It was a considerable kindness," Maggie insisted. "I wanted to thank you properly." "No thanks are needed," Joseph replied, returning his attention to the horse's hoof. "You showed respect to an old man last night. It was appreciated more than you might know." Something in his tone made Maggie look at him more closely. Despite his dignified bearing, she caught a glimpse of the loneliness that sometimes accompanied being different in a small frontier town. "Would you—" she began, then paused, wondering if she was overstepping. "Would you care to join me for coffee sometime? I make a decent pot, and I'd enjoy the company of someone with such interesting stories to tell." Joseph set down the horse's hoof and studied her face carefully, as if trying to determine whether the invitation was genuine or merely polite obligation. "I would like that very much," he said finally, "but I would not want to cause you trouble with your neighbors." Maggie thought of Mrs. Thornton's gossip and lifted her chin defiantly. "Let me worry about my neighbors, Mr. Standing Bear. How about tomorrow afternoon? Say, around 3 o'clock? Joseph nodded slowly, a real smile replacing his cautious expression. "Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, I will look forward to it." As Maggie walked home through the snow-covered streets, she felt lighter somehow, as if she'd taken a step toward something important without quite knowing what it might be. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains of Maggie's kitchen, casting delicate patterns across the scrubbed wooden table where she'd arranged her best china. She'd spent the morning baking molasses cookies and brewing what she hoped was the finest pot of coffee she'd ever made. At precisely 3 o'clock, she heard the gentle rap on her front door that she'd been both anticipating and dreading. Joseph Standing Bear stood on her porch, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and vest beneath his heavy coat. In his other hand, he carried a small bundle wrapped in soft doeskin. "Good afternoon, Maggie," he said, with that quiet dignity she was beginning to recognize as distinctly his. "I hope I am not late." "Right on time," she replied, stepping aside to welcome him in. "Please come in out of the cold." As Joseph removed his coat, Maggie noticed the careful attention he'd paid to his appearance. His long grey hair was freshly braided with new leather strips, and his boots had been polished to a shine. The gesture touched her. He'd taken as much care preparing for this visit as she had. "I brought something," he said, offering her the doeskin bundle. "A small gift to thank you for your hospitality." Maggie accepted the package with curiosity, feeling something firm but yielding beneath the soft leather. When she unwrapped it, she gasped with delight. Inside was a pair of beautifully beaded moccasins, the leather as soft as butter and decorated with intricate patterns in blues and greens that reminded her of mountain lakes. "Oh, Joseph, these are beautiful, but I couldn't possibly—" "They are practical," he interrupted gently. "Good for walking quietly and warm in winter. My sister made them. She has more skill with beadwork than anyone I know." Maggie turned the moccasins over in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. Each tiny bead had been placed with precision, creating flowing patterns that seemed to tell a story of their own. "Your sister made these. She's incredibly talented. Blue Dove woman. She lives on the reservation with her family, but she remembers the old ways of making things to last." Joseph's expression grew thoughtful. "She said any woman who would show kindness to a stranger deserved to walk in comfort." "Please give her my deepest thanks," Maggie said, touched by the gesture from someone she'd never met. "And thank you. I'll treasure them." She led Joseph to the kitchen, where the coffee waited, and afternoon light made everything warm and welcoming. As they settled at the table, Maggie poured coffee into her best cups and offered the plate of cookies. "These smell wonderful," Joseph said, accepting a cookie. "It has been many years since I sat in a kitchen like this." "Oh? You've lived in houses before?" Joseph took a sip of coffee, his eyes growing distant with memory. "When I was young, perhaps 12 summers, I lived for 3 years at the mission school in Fort Benton. The teachers there, they wanted us to learn the white man's ways. We lived in dormitories, ate at long tables, wore uniforms." Maggie leaned forward, interested. "What was that like for you?" "Difficult at first," Joseph admitted. "Everything was so structured, bells to tell us when to wake, when to eat, when to study, and we were forbidden to speak Crow, even among ourselves. But I was curious about reading and writing. The power of putting thoughts on paper fascinated me. Did you miss your family terribly? Every day. But my father, Tall Horse, he thought it would be good for me to understand both worlds. He said changes were coming whether we welcomed them or not, and knowledge would be a weapon more powerful than any rifle. Joseph smiled sadly. He was wiser than I understood at the time. Maggie refilled their cups, noting how Joseph seemed to relax as he talked. When did you decide to return to your people? The winter I turned 15. My youngest sister became very sick, and my mother sent word asking me to come home. The teachers said I should stay, finish my education, maybe become a clerk or translator for the government. But family calls stronger than any other voice. And your sister, did she recover? She did. Blue Dove woman, the one who made your moccasins. She was perhaps 7 then, so thin and weak we thought we might lose her, but she had a spirit too strong for sickness to claim. Joseph's face brightened with obvious affection. Now she has 4 children of her own and enough energy to keep up with all of them. Maggie smiled at the warmth in his voice. It sounds like you made the right choice, coming home. I believe so. Though there were times— Joseph paused, seeming to weigh his words. There were times when I felt caught between 2 worlds, not fully belonging to either. The white officials saw me as Indian, useful, but not truly trustworthy. Some of my own people saw me as too much influenced by white ways. That must have been lonely, Maggie said softly. Yes, but also useful. When there are disputes, misunderstandings between our peoples, sometimes it helps to have someone who can speak both languages, understand both ways of thinking. Joseph met her eyes. What about you, Maggie O'Sullivan? What brought you to Silver Creek? Maggie wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, drawing comfort from its warmth. My husband Patrick and I came west from Chicago about 8 years ago. He'd heard there was good money to be made in the mining camps, and we were young enough to think adventure sounded better than security. You were happy here? Oh yes, very happy. Patrick found work at the Lucky Strike mine, and I started taking in laundry and mending. Eventually we saved enough to buy this house and turn it into a boarding house. We had such plans. Her voice trailed off, the familiar ache of loss settling in her chest. What happened to him? Joseph asked gently. Cave-in at the mine, 3 years ago this winter. Patrick was trying to help get other men out when the supports gave way. Maggie's voice remained steady, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the cup. They said he saved 2 men's lives before the rocks took him. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting deep understanding. A good death, but hard for those left behind. Yes, Maggie whispered. Some days I'm proud of what he did. Other days I'm angry that he didn't think about what would happen to me. Most days I just miss having someone to talk to at the end of the day. You have no children? Maggie shook her head. We tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. Maybe it's for the best. This life can be hard enough for adults, let alone children. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own memories. Finally, Joseph spoke again. My wife was called Morning Star. She died 7 winters ago, during the hunger time when the buffalo had grown scarce and the government rations were late again. She caught a fever and— He stopped, his jaw tightening with old pain. I was away, guiding a survey crew, trying to earn money for medicine. When I returned, she was already buried. Oh, Joseph, I'm so sorry. We had been married 28 years. I thought I would die from the emptiness. Joseph looked out the window at the snow-covered mountains. But life, it has a way of continuing whether we are ready or not. Did you have children together? A son. David, we called him. David Standing Bear. He joined the cavalry 5 years ago. Joseph's expression grew complicated. He serves at Fort Shaw now, fighting against raiders from other tribes. It is difficult, having a son who wears the blue coat. Maggie heard the pain in his voice and understood immediately. He's caught between worlds too, isn't he? Yes. He believes the only way forward for our people is to fully embrace the white man's way, complete assimilation. He thinks I am foolish to maintain the old customs, to still participate in the tribal councils. Joseph sighed deeply. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps I am too old to change with the times. Or perhaps, Maggie said firmly, there's value in preserving the best of both worlds while building bridges between them. From what I've heard about your work as a guide and translator, you've prevented more conflicts than you know. Joseph looked surprised. You have heard about my work? Word gets around in a small town. People respect what you do, Joseph, more than you might think. And yet here I sit in your kitchen. The first time in years I have been welcomed into a white person's home as a guest, rather than hired help." The comment hung in the air between them, highlighting the reality of the divisions that still existed, despite mutual respect. Maggie felt a flare of anger, not at Joseph but at the circumstances that made such a simple thing as sharing coffee seem remarkable. "Well then," she said decisively, "I hope this is the first of many such visits. Good conversation is hard to find in Silver Creek, and I'd consider it an honor to count you as a friend." Joseph's weathered face softened into a genuine smile. "I would like that very much, Maggie O'Sullivan. It has been a long time since I sat with someone who understood that friendship has no color." As the afternoon wore on, their conversation flowed more easily. Joseph told stories of his guiding expeditions, the time he'd helped a lost survey crew survive a week in the mountains, with nothing but pine nuts and stream water, or the morning he'd awakened to find a curious bear investigating his camp coffee. Maggie shared tales of her boarding house guests, the traveling salesman who'd tried to court her with samples of ladies' corsets, or the preacher who'd given such a rousing sermon on temperance that he'd converted himself and sworn off the cooking. Wine she used in her stew. They discovered they both loved to read, though Joseph's books were mostly borrowed from the territorial courthouse library, while Maggie treasured the small collection she and Patrick had brought west. They both enjoyed the challenge of difficult puzzles. Joseph carved intricate figures from wood during the long winter months, while Maggie worked complex needlepoint patterns that told stories in thread. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the kitchen, Joseph rose to leave. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation," he said, putting on his coat, "and for treating an old man like a friend instead of a curiosity. Thank you for the beautiful moccasins and for sharing your stories. Will you come again next week? Same time?" Joseph's smile was answer enough, but he nodded anyway. "I would be honored." As Maggie watched him walk down her front path, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the warm anticipation of a friendship that promised to grow deeper with time. Whatever the town gossips might say, she'd found something precious in Joseph Standing Bear's company, the simple pleasure of being understood by someone who'd also learned to navigate life's disappointments with grace and dignity. Inside, she cleared the coffee cups and carefully put away the beautiful moccasins, already looking forward to next week's conversation. For the first time since Patrick's death, her house felt less empty, filled with the echoes of genuine laughter and the promise of friendship that transcended the artificial barriers their world tried to impose. 2 months had passed since that first coffee visit, and Maggie found herself looking forward to Thursday afternoons with an eagerness that surprised her. What had begun as a simple gesture of kindness had blossomed into the most meaningful friendship she'd known since Patrick's death. Joseph's weekly visits had become the anchor of her week, a time for genuine conversation, shared stories, and the comfortable silence that only existed between true friends. This particular Thursday morning, however, brought unwelcome news. Harold Grayson, who owned both the general store and held the mortgage on her boarding house, stood in her kitchen with papers in his hand and an apologetic expression on his weathered face. "I'm real sorry about this, Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "But the bank in Helena is calling in loans, and I got no choice but to ask for what's owed." Maggie stared at the foreclosure notice, the words blurring as she tried to make sense of the numbers. "But Harold, I've never missed a payment, not once in 3 years. I know that, and I told them so, but they're consolidating their holdings, focusing on properties in bigger towns. They want their money back by the end of next month, or—" He gestured helplessly at the papers. $1,200, Maggie whispered, reading the figure that might as well have been 12,000 for all the hope she had of raising it. "In 6 weeks. Maybe you could sell to someone local? I heard the widow Morrison might be interested in running a boarding house now that her youngest is grown." Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she folded the notice. This house wasn't just her livelihood. It was her home, filled with memories of Patrick and the life they'd built together. The thought of losing it felt like losing him all over again. "I'll figure something out," she said, though she had no idea what that might be. After Harold left, Maggie sat at her kitchen table staring at the foreclosure papers until the words became meaningless marks on paper. She had perhaps $200 saved, earnings from the boarding house that she'd been carefully hoarding for emergencies. But $1,200? She might as well try to pluck the moon from the sky. When Joseph arrived at 3 o'clock, bringing with him the scent of pine and winter air, Maggie had managed to compose herself enough to greet him with a smile, but Joseph's keen eyes missed nothing. "Something troubles you today," he observed, as she poured coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. Maggie hesitated. Their friendship had grown deep enough that she trusted Joseph completely, but she didn't want to burden him with problems he couldn't solve. Just some business concerns. Nothing that can't be worked out. Joseph studied her face over his coffee cup. "In my experience, problems shared often become smaller. Problems carried alone grow heavier with time." Something in his gentle tone broke through her reserve, and the whole story came tumbling out. The foreclosure notice, the impossible sum required, the threat of losing everything she and Patrick had worked for. Joseph listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. "This banker in Helena," he said finally. "He has never seen this house, never met you, never witnessed how you care for your guests. No, to him I'm just numbers on a ledger, a risk to be minimized." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the table. "There might be a way," he said slowly, "but it would require trust, and it would certainly give the town gossip something to discuss." Maggie leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I have saved money over the years from my guiding work, not $1,200, but perhaps half that amount, and I know others who might help. Other guides, traders, even some of the tribal elders who respect what you did for me that night in the saloon. Joseph, I couldn't possibly ask you to—" "You are not asking. I am offering." His dark eyes were serious but warm. "You showed kindness to a stranger when you had no reason to do so. You welcomed me into your home when others would not. This is what friends do for each other." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. But what would people say? A white woman taking money from Indians? Some folks would call it scandalous. And what do you call losing your home because those same folks won't lift a finger to help? The simple logic of his words hit her like a physical blow. He was right, of course. The same people who would whisper about her accepting help from Joseph and his friends were the ones who would shake their heads sadly at her misfortune while doing nothing to prevent it. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you will think about it. Say you will not let pride prevent you from accepting friendship when it is freely offered." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Maggie excused herself, wiping her eyes quickly before answering. On her porch stood Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton and Mrs. Pearl Hammond, both wearing expressions of barely concealed excitement. "Margaret, dear," Mrs. Thornton began in her sweetest voice, "we were just passing by and thought we should warn you about something we've heard." "Warn me?" Mrs. Hammond leaned in conspiratorially. "Some people are saying that you've been entertaining that Indian fellow rather regularly. Now, we're sure it's all perfectly innocent, but you know how people talk. They're saying it looks improper," Mrs. Thornton added with false concern. "A widow living alone, receiving visits from a man, especially one of, well, different circumstances." Maggie felt her temper rising. "Joseph Standing Bear is a respected member of this community and a dear friend. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to discuss it with me directly." "Oh, we're not judging, dear," Mrs. Hammond said quickly. "We just thought you should know what people are saying, for your own reputation's sake. Especially now," Mrs. Thornton added meaningfully, "when you might need the goodwill of your neighbors for other matters." The implication was clear. They knew about her financial troubles, and they were suggesting that her friendship with Joseph might cost her what little support she might otherwise receive from the community. "I appreciate your concern," Maggie said coldly, "but I'm quite capable of managing my own reputation and my own friendships. Good day, ladies." She closed the door with perhaps more force than necessary and returned to the kitchen where Joseph sat perfectly still, his face carefully neutral. "You heard?" she asked. "Enough." Joseph rose from his chair. "Perhaps I should not come here any more. I would not want to cause you difficulties." "Sit down," Maggie said firmly. "Those women don't speak for this town, and they certainly don't speak for me. You are welcome in my home, Joseph Standing Bear, for as long as you choose to come." Joseph studied her face carefully. "Even if it costs you the help you might need from your neighbors." Maggie thought of the foreclosure notice lying on her counter, of the impossible task of raising $1,200 in 6 weeks. Then she thought of the genuine friendship she'd found with Joseph, the conversations that had brought light back into her lonely world. "Some things are worth more than money," she said quietly. "Real friendship is one of them." Joseph's expression softened. "Then you will consider my offer. You will let me help?" Maggie looked around her kitchen, at the table where she and Patrick had shared their morning coffee, at the window where she'd watched for his return from the mines, at the chairs where she and Joseph now sat every Thursday afternoon, building something beautiful and unexpected. "Yes," she said finally. "I'll consider it. And Joseph, thank you for everything." As if summoned by her decision, another knock came at the door. This time it was Tom Bradley, her boarder, his face flushed with excitement. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, you'll never guess what just happened." He glanced at Joseph with surprise but continued enthusiastically. "I was at the telegraph office when a message came through from the territorial governor himself. He's coming to Silver Creek next month for some kind of official business, and he specifically asked that Joseph Standing Bear be available to serve as his translator and guide." Joseph looked surprised. "The governor requested me personally?" "By name," Tom confirmed. "The message said something about your reputation for fairness and your knowledge of both cultures. This is a big honor, Mr. Standing Bear. The governor doesn't travel with just anyone." After Tom left to spread the news around town, Maggie and Joseph sat in thoughtful silence. Finally, Maggie spoke. "Seems like your reputation extends farther than Silver Creek." "It seems so." Joseph's voice was wondering. "This could change things. A personal recommendation from the territorial governor carries considerable weight. Enough weight to make the town gossips think twice about their opinions." Joseph smiled. "Perhaps. Though I have learned not to count on such things too heavily." As they finished their coffee and Joseph prepared to leave, Maggie felt a sense of possibilities opening before them. The foreclosure notice still lay on her counter, the threat as real as ever. But somehow, with Joseph's friendship and support, the problem no longer seemed insurmountable. "Same time next week?" she asked as he put on his coat. "Same time next week," he confirmed. "And Maggie, we will find a way to save your home, I give you my word." As she watched him walk away through the late afternoon shadows, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since Patrick's death, the comforting knowledge that she wasn't facing her troubles alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with a true friend by her side. Inside, she picked up the foreclosure notice and read it again. The numbers were still impossible, the timeline still crushing. But for the first time since Harold Grayson had delivered the devastating news, Maggie O'Sullivan felt a flicker of hope. 3 weeks had passed since the territorial governor's visit to Silver Creek, and the entire town was still talking about it. Governor Benjamin Potts had arrived with a small entourage, conducted his official business with impressive efficiency, and departed, but not before publicly praising Joseph Standing Bear's invaluable assistance and announcing a new territorial position, Chief Cultural Liaison, a role that would involve helping resolve disputes between settlers and tribal communities across Montana Territory. The job came with a substantial salary and, more importantly, the kind of official recognition that transformed how people viewed Joseph overnight. Suddenly, the same folks who had whispered about Maggie's friendship with him were eager to claim they'd always known he was a man of importance. Maggie smiled at the irony as she finished packing the last of her belongings into wooden crates. The timing of Joseph's promotion couldn't have been better for changing public opinion, but it had come too late to save her house. Despite the generous contributions from Joseph and several of his friends, both native and white, they had managed to raise only $800, leaving her $400 short of what the bank demanded. The foreclosure had proceeded as scheduled, and tomorrow morning she would hand over the keys to Mrs. Morrison, who had indeed decided to purchase the property for her own boarding house venture. Maggie had found a small apartment above Hendrick's hardware store, a cramped but clean space that would serve as her new home while she figured out her next steps. A soft knock at the kitchen door interrupted her melancholy packing. She opened it to find Joseph standing on her back porch, but instead of his usual warm smile, his face wore an expression of barely contained excitement. "Good afternoon, Maggie," he said, his eyes twinkling with some secret pleasure. "I have come to give you something, but first you must promise me you will not refuse it." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "That's a dangerous promise to make before I know what I'm agreeing to." "Trust me," Joseph said simply, "as I have trusted you." Unable to resist his earnest request, Maggie nodded. "All right, I promise." Joseph's smile broke free then, transforming his weathered features. "Good. Now I need you to come with me to the stable. There is something there you must see." Curious and slightly worried, Maggie followed Joseph through the snow-covered streets to Morrison's livery stable. As they approached, she could see several people gathered near the main entrance. Tom Bradley, Samuel Hartwell, Martha Henley, and even Harold Grayson, all wearing expressions of barely suppressed excitement. "What's all this about?" Maggie asked, but Joseph simply guided her toward the stable doors. Inside, in the center of the main aisle, stood the most beautiful saddle Maggie had ever seen. It was crafted from elk hide the color of rich honey, tooled with intricate patterns that seemed to flow like water across the leather. Silver conchos caught the afternoon light streaming through the stable windows, and the stirrups were wrapped with beaded leather in the same blues and greens as her moccasins. But it wasn't just the saddle that took her breath away. It was what lay draped across it. A leather saddlebag bulged with what was unmistakably money, and attached to the saddle horn was an envelope bearing her name in Joseph's careful handwriting. "I don't understand," Maggie whispered, her hand going to her throat. Joseph moved to stand beside the magnificent saddle, his hand resting on its pommel. "This saddle was made by my brother-in-law, White Eagle, as a gift for his daughter's wedding. It took him nearly a year to complete. The hunting of the elk, the tanning of the hide, the careful tooling of every pattern. It was to be the finest saddle he had ever created." "It's beautiful," Maggie breathed, "but I still don't understand why—" "His daughter died of fever 2 weeks before her wedding," Joseph continued quietly. "White Eagle was heartbroken, ready to burn the saddle rather than be reminded of his loss. But his wife, my sister, Blue Dove Woman, convinced him there was a better way to honor their daughter's memory." Joseph picked up the envelope and handed it to Maggie. "Read this." With trembling hands, Maggie opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. It was written in English, but she could see it had been carefully translated from another language. "To the white woman who showed respect to our brother, Joseph Standing Bear. Our daughter, Morning Light, was to be married with this saddle. She died before the wedding, but her spirit was strong and kind, like the woman who gave her chair to an elder. We give this saddle to you, not from sadness, but from joy that our daughter's memory can help someone who understands that kindness has no color. The money in the saddlebags comes from many people, hunters, traders, farmers, both white and crow, who heard your story and wanted to help. We do not give charity. We give respect to someone who earned it. May you ride with the blessing of Morning Light's spirit, and may your house remain your home. White Eagle and Blue Dove Woman, for the Crow Nation." Maggie's vision blurred as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Joseph, I can't possibly accept this. It's too much, too precious." "You promised," Joseph reminded her gently. "And besides, you must accept it. There are conditions." "Conditions?" Tom Bradley stepped forward, grinning widely. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, the money in those saddlebags. It's not just a gift, it's an investment." Samuel Hartwell nodded enthusiastically. "We've all been talking, and we think Silver Creek needs an official cultural center, a place where people from different backgrounds can meet, learn from each other, maybe prevent some of the misunderstandings that lead to trouble." Martha Henley clasped her hands together. "And who better to run such a place than someone who's already proven she can bring people together? Someone who's shown that friendship can bridge any divide." Harold Grayson stepped forward, looking somewhat sheepish. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I talked to the bank in Helena. With this money you can pay off the foreclosure and have enough left over to convert part of your boarding house into a meeting hall. The territorial government is willing to provide additional funding for such a project, especially with Joseph's new position, to help coordinate it." Maggie looked around at the faces surrounding her, people she'd known for years, but had never imagined could come together for such a purpose. "You're all serious about this?" "As serious as Sunday service," Samuel confirmed. "Maggie, you and Joseph have shown this town something important. Maybe it's time we all learned from your example." Joseph moved to stand beside her, his voice warm with emotion. "The saddle is not just a gift, Maggie, it is a symbol. In Crow tradition, a saddle represents the bond between horse and rider, the trust that allows them to travel far together. This saddle represents the bond between our peoples, the trust that you and I have built through simple friendship." Maggie reached out to touch the smooth elk hide, feeling the careful workmanship beneath her fingers. "Morning Light," she whispered. "What was she like?" "Strong-willed," Joseph said with a smile. "Quick to laugh, quicker to defend anyone she thought was being treated unfairly. Very much like someone else I know." The tears came freely now, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Maggie thought of all the Thursday afternoons she and Joseph had spent building their friendship, never imagining it would grow into something that could transform an entire community. "There's one more thing," Joseph said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small leather pouch and opened it to reveal a delicate silver pin shaped like two hands clasped in friendship. "This was made by the silversmith in Fort Benton, using silver from a mine your husband once worked. It is for you to wear when you officially open the Silver Creek Cultural Center." Maggie took the pin with reverence, understanding its significance. Patrick's mine, her house, Joseph's wisdom, and the combined goodwill of two communities, all coming together to create something neither could have achieved alone. "I accept," she said finally, her voice strong despite her tears. "I accept the saddle, the money, the responsibility, and the honor, but most of all I accept the friendship that made all of this possible." As the small crowd erupted in cheers and congratulations, Joseph took Maggie's hand and led her outside. The winter sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered town in shades of gold and rose. "You know what this means?" he asked as they stood together in the twilight. "That I'll have the privilege of working alongside the finest man I've ever known?" Joseph chuckled. "That too, but I was thinking more practically. We'll need to find you a horse worthy of that saddle." Maggie laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I suppose we will. Though I should warn you, it's been years since I've ridden." "Then we will learn together," Joseph said. "After all, the best journeys are always shared with a friend." As they walked back toward her house, which would remain her home, Maggie marveled at the unexpected turns life could take. Her simple act of kindness in a storm-bound saloon had blossomed into a friendship that had not only saved her home, but had planted the seeds for something much larger, a place where people could come together, learn from each other, and build the kind of understanding that made communities stronger. The elk hide saddle would hang in the main room of the Silver Creek Cultural Center, a symbol of the bridge that could be built between different worlds when people were willing to see past. Surface differences to the human heart beneath. And every time Maggie looked at it, she would remember that the most precious gifts often come not from wealth or status, but from the simple courage to treat others with kindness and respect. 6 months later, as she sat in the main room of the thriving cultural center, watching Joseph teach a group of local children, both white and native, how to braid leather in the traditional way, Maggie smiled at the memory of that snowy evening when she'd offered her chair to a stranger. She'd thought she was simply being polite. Instead, she'd discovered that sometimes the smallest gestures can change everything, creating ripples of goodness that spread far beyond what any one person could imagine. The elk-hide saddle gleamed in the afternoon sun, and Maggie could almost hear the echo of Morning Light's laughter in the voices of the children, learning that friendship truly has no color, and that the best gifts are those that honor both the giver and the receiver with equal respect.